Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Mahvand, Espily, Petra Auer, Lydia Murphy, and Tommaso Santilli will talk about the role of values in inclusive education.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, a little bit excited.
Yeah, it's great to be able to talk about values.
Yeah, it's a very important topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Very excited about the topic we are going to talk about
Sure,
today.
I'm exciting. Yeah, yes.
So, Petra, what's your cup of tea?
Well, my cup of tea, it's creativity.
Oh, okay, very nice.
And what's your cup of tea?
My cup of tea is honesty.
Oh, nice. And what's your cup of tea?
My cup of tea is social power.
As you could see, we all pulled out different words of our cups. These words were all words that people use to talk about values. But what are values? To put it very simply, when we talk about values, we talk about what is important to us, what goals we strive for, and what are the guiding principles in our lives. And in the past, many different scholars worked on the concept of values. And so many different definitions arise from this. Even though many of the theories have a lot of things in common and similarities. So what the sociopsychologist Shalom Schwartz did was he did a synthesis of all of the previous works done on values with creating his basic human values theory. And within his theory, he defines values as desirable trans-situational goals. So that means that they are effective across situations. Further, they differ in their relative importance, and as such, they are guiding principles in the life of a person or another social entity. That can be a society, a social group, but it can also be simply a school class. And as such, values are also part of our self-concept. So values tell also something about who we are because they say what is important to us. And part of Schwartz's work consisted in the categorization of values. So what he did was he collected words around the world in many different languages that people used to talk about values. And then he summarized them into the 10 value types. So we can also say that he made a little bit order in all of the different words people use to talk about values. And he did summarize them based on their underlying motivational goals because values also guide our actions, they guide our behavior. And due to this motivational aspect of values, they are also interrelated dynamically. So values can harmonize with each other, but they can also be in conflict. And this builds a circular structure. So the 10 value types, they create kind of a circle. And these dynamic relationships between the 10 value types, they can be also seen visually in this circle. For example, values which lie in the circle close to each other, they are very similar, they are compatible with each other, they harmonize, whereas those lying on the opposite, they are not compatible, they are in conflict with each other. Let's try to make this a little bit more concrete. Imagine that you're a group of persons, in the best case you're a group of friends and you're hiking up the mountain. One person starts to struggling, others are fine, and then there's a very small group of people who is almost running up the hill. So if in that situation it is important to you to take care of the persons close to you, you would stay with the struggling person, try to help her and to get up on the top of the mountain too, or just to be safe. This is a benevolence value. And benevolence values are compatible, for example, with universalism values. In that case, it would be important for you that all the group gets up to the top of the mountain and no one is left behind. Instead, if achievement values would be important to you, it would be important to you to show what you're capable of. In that case, you would try to catch up with the group who is running up, or simply also just try to be the first one on the top of the mountain. So here you can see it will not be possible to combine these two values. Nevertheless, it can happen that both of the values are important for you, and there you would become also aware of their competing nature. And it's also one of the very rare occasions where you become aware of your values, because most of the time values are just unconscious and they just guide your behavior in everyday situations. What maybe also become clear in this example, where we let it become a little bit more concrete, is that different values can be important. So it can be important to me, benevolence values and achievement values, but then I need to decide in specific situations for one of the two. And I guess it's also important to say that all of the values are important, and this is also what Schwartz is arguing, that all of the values in the end are important for a group or for societies to work. Just let's sum up what values are. Values are what is important to us. They guide our behavior, and values can be compatible or incompatible with each other. And this maybe also already leads us a little bit to our second questions. Why? Why are values important when we talk about inclusive education? I would like to make this again a little bit more concrete with the example of the Index for Inclusion, which is a resource for the inclusive development of schools. And in the Index of Inclusion, the two authors, Booth and Ainscough, they argue that when we want as a school to develop towards inclusion, or more specifically evolve inclusive cultures, then values take on really a key role, because they are kind of the foundation. They are part of the cultures. And in the index, you can also find a very big part on inclusive values. And as a school, you can work on very different levels with these inclusive values. For example, on the community level, on the school level, and on the classroom level. And this already gives us a little bit of an impression that values seem to be everywhere. But Lydia, where exactly do we find the values?
Thanks, Petra, for explaining what values are and why we need our values. And I'm going to delve into Bronfenbrenner's theory to show where values might come up, both consciously and unconsciously. Bronfenbrenner revised his theory several times, but his last theory included the PPCT model, the person, process, context over time. And I'm just going to run through and give concrete examples of the PCCT model. The process of relationships is the bi-directional engagement of the person with the environment. This could be both other humans or objects or symbols. It can be included in activities, roles, or interpersonal relationships. For example, if I'm in an environment that's loving and caring as their values, I'm more likely to go out and be loving and caring. Whereas if I'm in an environment that values competition over connection, I possibly would aim for perfection over possibly curiosity. So our personal characteristics come into play when we're engaging with others. And this is the second part of Bronfenbrenner's model. And personal characteristics differ from values because it tells us what the person is like, and values tell you what the person is striving for. So your internal values and your internal characteristics. We could possibly ask the question, what is it like to meet me? And encompass both. But Bronfenbrenner broke this down into 3 different characteristic types. I'm just going to talk about one, which is the demand characteristics. These might encourage engagement or discourage engagement in the social environment. Values are always at play within this context. So broadening the child, no child grows up in isolation, and usually our struggles, our strengths are not created in a vacuum. There's usually context around the child and the family. So within the microsystem, we have the child and the people close to the child in their family, including their school. Next, we have what connects the school and the family, or the school and the child, and how these contexts could be possibly the same or different. A little toddler was at home and she was used to having birthday parties and blowing out birthday cakes, but she was being christened and she was brought to a church. And when she seen the candle, she thought to herself, I know what to do here because I know that you blow out the candle. But in the different context, it wasn't socially valued to blow out the candle, but she was used to candles being blown out. So we have to be really reflective of our values across contexts, and how it might be socially acceptable in one context to value something, and it might be not so socially acceptable in another. So how can we reflect on our relationships between contexts? And lastly, we're going to move out to policy and the macro and the effects of the macro on the child and family and the school. And within early years right now, we're actually looking at more grassroots policies, and we're actually asking the babies and toddlers and children and the educators working on the ground what they would like to see in education in Ireland, thankfully. But sometimes and previously, policies could make the child or the educator feel powerful or powerless. And of course, as I'm talking there, there's change and evolvement. But research would suggest that values don't really change over time. They may adapt, but they're very hard to change in terms of past values, present values and future values over time. Bronfenbrenner would locate this within historical and social time. But I wonder, could you, Tom, locate this even further?
Thank you, Lydia. Yeah. That was really interesting, and I agree with the fact that it might be tricky to look for values when we have so many levels, and we need to understand probably what's the fil rouge that connects all of these levels and let us understand where we can find values and work with them. And in the sense, in the macro level, the meso level, the micro, or whatsoever, the connection is human agency. So all of those levels are context, and such contexts are the products of our actions or someone else's actions. And to understand the relationship between our individual values and also our context and what values those contexts communicate us, we should delve into design as a practice. We can broadly interpret the act of designing as an act of creative and critical reflection that leads us to envisioning and imagining and then creating something that does not already exist. And it can be either about products, services, spaces, but also about symbols and communities and organizations. So in all different shapes and sizes, we could say. And by doing so, we're using a tool, design, which is a primary communication tool, because whenever we set the regulations and the rules that will sort of guide a community, or whenever we try and we decide the layout of a physical space, or when we plan our lesson as teachers, we are designing and we are infusing our own values into concrete actions and into fixed structures. So grasping design principles and practices could help us understand how we can use those to promote inclusion within educational contexts at all levels. If we look at the bigger picture, we have policies that regulate educational systems, whether they are international or national or local. And in the sense, when policymakers create those regulations that sort of set the boundaries within which we act as educators, they are drawing inspiration from social norms and therefore social values, which is basically they compose the ideal heritage of references that we have and that guide our actions as communities. So the idea is that all of these regulations, they convey and they are the first source of values in a way, and we can find in national and international regulations some values that are embedded in those words. We can, for instance, cite the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 26 is about education. And in the sense, it also unveils some primary values that should underlie education across nations and cultures. For instance, equality in access or personal development. The Index for Inclusion itself that you cited, Petra, works the same way because it is a fixed structure of values that we could connect to inclusion. Of course, when we reflect upon those upper levels, it's hard to imagine how design can help us individually, but we can go down and narrow the context to understand our agency and how we can work with values. In this sense, we could understand design as a more narrow concept, so the design of the learning environment, our classrooms or our schools, for instance. And designing the learning environment means designing, planning, and realizing and deciding how learners will learn. And in the sense, we are working on the context, on the environment, and we are setting some factors. Such factors could operate as facilitators or barriers. They could obstacle or they could facilitate learning for our students. And it's our own responsibility to understand what we have to do. In this sense, we are not alone in a way, but we can look at universal design as an approach that helps us finding the way towards inclusion across contexts. So universal design is a framework, it's an approach that guides design, and it's aimed at increasing the accessibility of products, services, or contexts to the greatest extent of people possible, regardless of personal differences. And to show that design is connected to values and communicates values, universal design is actually based on a set of principles. And such principles are like equity in access, or simplicity in use, or flexibility in use. And such values are not only related to the most intuitive uses of design, such as architecture maybe, but they can be applied wherever. So I start from the design of a chair, but I end up designing a didactic material, because we know that for it to be inclusive, it has to be equitable in terms of access. It can be flexible in terms of use and simple in terms of use as well. And going further in this direction, we can also assess the presence of a framework that helps us as educators and teachers focus on the role of design and values in designing these learning environments, which is universal design for learning. So we can identify three main trajectories of universal design for learning, which is based upon providing multiple means of representation of knowledge, but also multiple means of expression of knowledge for our students. And lastly, multiple means of engagement. And in this sense, we are embracing learner diversity. We are communicating our specific values, and we are working towards inclusion. And I would like to quote a psychologist, James Gibson. He's done a lot of work for the design discourse, but we could also use some of that for our pedagogy discourse. And he used to say that we are terrestrial animals and that we were created by the world we live in. So in a sense, we might as well reflect upon the world that created us, but also the worlds that we wish to create for our students. And maybe Mahvand, in this more practical dimension, you could let us understand how we can work with values.
Yeah, thank you very much from Tom. And the question is that how can I work with values? And teachers can reflect personal values on teaching practices because their values influence their teaching methods and their interaction with the students. They can identify to improve the areas needed more. Identify core values, which is more important in their beliefs and relationships. And by analyzing crucial events and introspection lead to self-awareness. Teachers should review and analyze their last experiences to make sense when and how feel most fulfilled and oriented moments with their values. It should evaluate consistently and will be helpful addressing any discrepancies. Now verify a case which happened between students in class. During friendly discussion, students choose a drama, talking about scenarios and analyzing story in different aspects and find all needs. They start to apportion duties depend on their interests and abilities. For instance, acting, designing brochure, selecting appropriate music or playing instruments, organizing clothes for actors and actresses, and preparing salon for viewers. Students will touch hardly various values indirectly, such as responsibility, respect, cooperation, sympathy, listening various opinions, and companionship. As a result, they understand each of them have an effective role by all differences, abilities, and disabilities. This real case shows that making an activity can be touchable more than giving a speech about values. Brilliant matter is that many values are hidden behind a value. When they are commitment to and responsibility, surely they have done many small values as well, and finally responsibility will rise. Second example is about my 5th grade students, around 20 members. They had many challenges with each other, many argues, lack of listening each other, using bad words, and fighting. Each day, all teachers had meetings to give many ideas to find solution about it. They've needed to practice many values, so I've started having friendly discussions with them and let them talk more and more about their emotions, difficulties, and desires. Little by little, during many discussions, they've started finding solution by themselves. Practicing to listen each other was on top of their solution and giving opportunity and be patient to change. Also, I've organized many trips because it was an appropriate ground to practice many values, such as discussing, listening, being empathetic, kindness, be honest, and after 1 year, exclusive changes happened in their relationships. It was impressive for teachers and their families as well. Continuation, maintaining, and cooperation of teachers, families, and children create growth, maturity, and many values within them.
I must admit that now listening to you, Mahvand, and reflecting myself, I must admit that I was a bit irritated by your cup of tea, the cup of tea you showed us. So social power, it irritated me a little bit. But now listening to you, I guess it's just important that we need to talk about what is important to you, what is important to me, what is important to you. Because in the end, all value have their value.
Yeah. And Tom, we forgot to ask you, what's your cup of tea?
What do you mean? I have literal tea inside.
Your value. What's your value?
No, that's just tea. You know what? Let's forget it. I'm gonna go back to the piano.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.